Great. And I'm just going to start it real quick and I'll get started in a couple minutes. I'll kick it off.
Sounds good.
Any last minute questions before I do?
Oh, just Nick, remember I'm gonna stop sharing on that one slide.
Okay. Yep. I've got it pulled up on my side, so I'll just start sharing when you stop.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, here we go. Okay, hello and welcome everyone to Evaluating a Realistic and Inclusive Weed Management Plan. My name is Claire Weinzerl and I'm the Communications Manager at the Illinois Soybean Association. Please join me in thanking our corporate partner, FMC, for sponsoring our webinar today. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window and we will answer those following the presentation. And one more note that today's webinar will be recorded in the event that you would like to rewatch it or share it with your network. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Nick Hustedde and Drake Copeland. Nick earned his bachelor's degree in plant and soil science and master's degree in plant, soil, and agricultural systems, specializing in weed science from Southern Illinois University. Nick serves as a technical service manager for FMC Corporation, focusing on research and development, as well as providing technical information to his sales team in the states of Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri. His goal is to contribute insight on current and new product concept strategies through research and development. Drake Copeland earned his bachelor's degree in ag business from the University of Tennessee and his master's degree in agronomy from Mississippi State University and his doctorate degree in weed science from the University of Tennessee. He has been a technical service manager with FMC Corporation for 4 years, servicing Ohio, Michigan, and Eastern Indiana. Prior to joining FMC, Drake worked as a research associate at the University of Tennessee. Today, Nick and Drake will be presenting Evaluating a Realistic and Inclusive Weed Management Plan. Growers don't just fight one weed, they're contending with multiple species every season. This requires a mapped out weed management program that utilizes realistic strategies and a holistic approach to effectively target these species leading up to and during the growing season. During today's presentation, Nick and Drake will discuss the insights, strategies, and tools required to develop a multidimensional plan to counter yield robbing weeds in 2022 and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Nick and Drake.
Thank you for that introduction, and kind of want to begin the conversation by laying out a timeline of what we're going to discuss today. As she mentioned, really talking about weed biology, its impact on crop production. Big thing with weed control these days is we know that the soil seed bank needs to be managed, and we've got tools to help us succeed with that. And Nick's going to end the conversation looking at a holistic view, implementing both chemical and agronomic practices to help manage the weeds that we encounter year in and year out. But we also know that in the Eastern Corn Belt, we have WATERHEMP, which drives a lot of the herbicide decisions we make. And you've probably heard it from some of your agronomists. If you're effectively managing WATERHEMP, odds are you're effectively managing other weeds within that system. But today, going to kind of talk through a little bit of biology on water hemp, and then some things to expect from other weeds, and how things that maybe we don't pour out of a jug can help with weed control. So I took this is a snapshot from the Weed Science Resistance Committee, who basically they take all the unique resistant biotypes within each state, and I just tallied up the numbers of unique resistant weed biotypes within each state. And you can see, they range from anywhere from, in South Dakota, there's 9 herbicide resistant weeds, over into Illinois, where we have 29 unique cases of herbicide resistance. And I think the 2 that are most recent would be the group 15 resistance, as well as some of the group 4 resistance that's showing up in Illinois and Indiana. Though those are very small pockets within those populations, it's important to document that those species or biotypes do exist. And it's not just an issue in the Eastern Corn Belt. If we look at this trend from the 50s all the way to 2020, it's something that continues to evolve as we release new modes of action up until when Roundup Ready came out. We really started putting a lot more pressure on post-herbicide applications and herbicides in general, and kind of got us to where we are today. Now, there has been a lot of efforts with implementing things that, like I mentioned earlier, we don't pour out of a jug to control these weeds, but just note that it's not just an issue in the U.S. This is a challenge that we're facing across the globe. Before we really dive into herbicide resistance, we need to know the cause of it. And a lot of people think that the herbicides are actually causing the resistance, but the reality is we're actually selecting for resistant individuals within the population that are resistant to those herbicides. Meaning, when you take something like water hemp, for example, very diverse in terms of genetics and how it responds to herbicides. And over time, if we deploy the same strategy, we always talk about Roundup. If we keep spraying Roundup, oftentimes over time, you will select for an individual that it just does not work on. And if we let that weed go to seed, you'll see in the illustration below, eventually will lead to a population shift where most of your population is now resistant. And you talk to some growers that have been around the block farming 20, 30 years, when they first had glyphosate resistance show up on their farm, usually shows up in a little pocket, maybe on the edge of a field, not really thinking it's an issue. And then we run the combine through it, get the chaff and seed spread across the field. And then, in 2 or 3 years, we've really got a problem. So that's how we actually cause resistance, is actually selecting for those individuals that are actually naturally already within that population. And what that causes when you do that is a population shift. And this is just a hypothetical example, but on the y-axis, we have percent of the weed population. And then on the x-axis, we have the number of years. So say 10, 12 years ago, grower A had half his weed problems from MARESTAIL and the other half were common lamb's quarter. And then a common water hemp plant that is resistant to the herbicide program that he is utilizing appears on his farm, whether it's through equipment, whether it got there from some other way, or he selected for this water hemp biotype to be on his farm. And what happens is, over time, you'll begin to control your MARESTAIL and common lamb's quarters to a point where it's actually not a problem. Your problem actually becomes that water hemp. So it's just something you've got to keep in the back of your mind when these new biotypes enter a farming system. And I think one way to show it, besides herbicide resistance, is what we encountered in 2019. You look at Illinois having 1.5 million acres that would prevent planted just because of the wet spring we had 2019. Folks could not get out in the fields to plant corn nor soybeans. And a lot of the fields laid fallow, like the one we see in this image where you see water hemp going to seed. And maybe in some cases, water hemp or the driver weed within that system was not a huge issue, but we let those go to seed in 2019. And as Nickel mentioned, 1 year of seeding from all these weeds being in the field will lead to 5 to 7 years of weeding. So 2019 is a situation where guys are seeing weeds that they haven't either seen in a while or really weren't a big issue, and now they are because of that year and trying to manage those fallow acres in 2019. we oftentimes talk about seed production from Amaranthus species, and I've got several listed here from WATERHEMP all the way to Palmer Amaranth. And you always hear the acronym, you know, WATERHEMP or Palmer produces 1 million seed per acre, and that is not always true. I mean, if the plants are growing all by themselves with no competition for sunlight, nutrients, water, we could probably get up in the 1.5 million seed per plant stage. But the reality is, in competition with soybeans, this is what we can expect. And it's still a very robust amount of numbers. You look at WATERHEMP in competition with soybean is still putting on 250, 300,000 seed per plant. So it is a numbers game. We know that 95% control is no longer acceptable just due to the fact of the number of seed that a weed like WATERHEMP or Palmer Amaranth can put out. One thing that we do that stands to lead to resistance, and you talk about this year with shortages and whatnot, people have an allotted amount of the herbicide thinking they can reduce rates and get across more acres. And that's what we don't want to do, because when we do that, if you look at the image here, this is a weed that would basically satisfy most post-emergence herbicide labels. It's 3 to 4 inches tall. But if we start cutting that rate, you know, especially on something like Palmer Amaranth or WATERHEMP, I think in some cases you may control 60 or 70% of that population, but the odds are you're that 30, 40% that survives that, you're going to be dealing with for the rest of the season. And we know there's research, you know, out there. If weeds do survive a herbicide application, over time they're actually harder to control. So we want to do it right the first time. Sublethal rates are not the way to do it, especially with the fact that we can amplify that selection pressure for resistance. This next example is probably one of my favorites that we encounter in the field, you know, whether we're on a grower's farm or just checking out some sprays that went out during the season. You know, sometimes Mother Nature can get in the way. And you would expect in some cases, you know, where I talked about earlier, people cutting back on the rate. And then when they get really big weeds, they actually decide to use the full rate. And that full rate is actually designed for that. What we saw in the previous slide was that 3 to 4 inch weed. And now we're trying to go out and kill weeds that are a foot and a half tall. And basically doing that, you're again exposing that weed to a sublethal dose. Treating large weeds will absolutely lead to resistance if not managed properly, and those weeds actually still go to seed. So yes, we know we've got a weed that can go from the size of a period on a newspaper to 4 inches tall within 10 to 14 days. Not a lot of time for error, but it just shows you when those do get away from us, what can happen in terms of resistance. It absolutely can amplify that phenomenon from happening. So when we look at our driver weeds, I think it's worth a discussion to discuss other weeds within the system. You see here at the top, we've got MARESTAIL. That's a weed that we've actually learned to deal with over time. You notice that it has an emergence pattern that starts early in the fall or winter and leads out into the spring and summer, depending on where you are in the state of Illinois. But we've learned that fall burn down application, when we kill those MARESTAIL as they're emerging in the fall, we get away with a lot more in the spring. And what I mean by that, say if we don't go out with a fall burn down application and we wait until that March timeframe to put out my burn down, well, those weeds that germinated in the fall are now going to bolt and become harder to kill. So you think about a no-till production system where you're spraying 2 to 3 times before you even put seed in the ground because of fall emerged MARESTAIL. So that's something that over the past 8 to 10 years we've figured out is that fall burn down is absolutely key for MARESTAIL control in corn and soybeans. And then, of course, WATERHEMP and Palmer Amaranth, we know that depending on where you're at, when the soil temperatures get above that 50-degree mark, we start seeing emergence. And depending on how warm your fall is, it can lead to emergence within as late as September or October. Giant ragweed is one that I have in my territory in Ohio, Indiana, where we have biotypes that can emerge as early as late February all the way to the middle of summer. And I think there's some biotypes in Indiana and Illinois as well that can do that. But the key is all of those are emerging during our planting window. So a lot of what we do at planting from a herbicide standpoint is going to be critical for managing these driver weeds. So let's talk more about the biology of water hemp. If you're familiar with the species, you've probably seen this. This is a male water hemp next to a female water hemp. And the question was posed is, how long after successful pollination do we have viable seed on that female plant? Now, a lot of times you will see this either on the edge of the field, on the turn row, or in turning on into the field. Some cases, unfortunately, may be in the middle of your fields if your control tactics didn't work at the beginning. And the question is, how long do I have before there's seed on the plant? And there was a study actually conducted at the University of Illinois to kind of answer this question. And basically, if you look at the images on the right, when you get that dark, shiny coat, this is number of days after pollination. When you get that dark, shiny coat, you pretty much have viable seed. And you see at the top, there's an A temperature regime and then a B temperature regime. I believe the B is actually cooler temperatures. But what I take away from this slide is 7 to 10 days, regardless of temperature, you can expect viable seed to occur after that pollination occurs. So you really don't have a lot of time. It really speaks to filling up a cooler, going around, driving around, and making sure we get those weeds out of the field and not leaving them there because we're actually just putting seed back into the soil seed bank. Water hemp does have a weakness, though. As we all know, there are weeds out there like pitted morning glory and velvet leaf that can stay in the soil profile for 40 to 50 years and still germinate. I think another example that we all may be familiar with is common cocklebur. You've been in fields where you haven't seen it in 20 years, and if you kick the dirt just right, you'll get an emergence flush of common cocklebur. So that's another weed species that can last for a long time. But you look at water hemp, even after year 1, 50% of that seed is not even viable. And as we move to year 3 and year 4, you're getting down to that 10% viability range. It really speaks to, if we really stay on top of it, we can get ahead of water hemp. And we've got some interesting data we'll share later in this presentation on how we can do that. So the seed bank management, and these are the tools that we need to succeed. And I think the biggest one is one I've discussed already. What we do at planting kind of sets the stage for the rest of the year in terms of weed control. And the question I pose is, why do we use pre-herbicides in the first place? This is actually a Palmer amaranth infestation on one of the plots that we put out. And, you know, you've got a box here where I applied a herbicide that had 2 modes of action in it. And then you've got the rest of the field where no treatments were put out. And this is about 28, 30 days after application. And you'll see there's a few Palmer amaranth coming in between those soybean rows. And that's manageable. That's what our herbicides or post herbicides are built to control, are those misses or what we need to clean up from the pre-breaking, and also having a residual in the tank and getting that activated in the soil profile to get us to canopy closure. What we can't afford is to go out not putting out a pre and coming back and trying to kill the weeds that are outside this box. You know, you talk about a plant that's 4 inches tall that has 12 to 15 growing points, and we're trying to put our precious chemistries out there like glufosinate, dicamba, 2,4-D, other herbicides that still have activity post on water hemp or Palmer amaranth. You know, it's great that we have those tools, but when you're putting them out in front of this much pressure and expecting great results, it usually doesn't work out for us. So just something to keep in mind with pre-herbicides and what kind of value they add to the system. Obviously, there's some pros and cons to pre-herbicides. Obviously, we want to get an activating rainfall. And what happens is when we apply that herbicide to the soil surface, after it gets an activating rainfall, it actually leaches into the herbicide or into the soil profile. And we call that the herbicide treated zone. And for water hemp, for example, a lot of those seeds are going to emerge within the first inch of the soil profile. And then you'll have other larger seed broadleaves like giant ragweed that actually emerge way below that. So you may have some breaks just because of soil profile selectivity, but that's actually how they work to get that activating rainfall into where the weed seed germination zone is. Another thing to look at is the concept of overlapping residuals. We've talked about that pre-herbicide and how important that is. When we deploy that pre-herbicide at planting, that's when our residual clock starts ticking. We know there's chemical degradation processes that take place within the soil profile, environmental conditions that can move the herbicide to where it's no longer herbicidal, and it'll eventually break, like what we discussed earlier. And a lot of times we expect this about 3 to 5 weeks after we put that pre-residual out, just depending on the environment and the weed pressure that we experience within that environment. That's when we come back with that post-emergence application that includes the residual, because what we want to do is clean up the weeds that emerge when that pre-herbicide broke with the post-application, and then add the residual product and get that back up to 100% control. That way we're controlling weeds as seeds, and not as 4 to 6 inch weeds, which are putting more pressure on our foliar products. And it really speaks to this image right here. This is something Nick put out in Whitestown, Indiana, just north of Indianapolis. And this is 5 days after treatment, except for there's some residual herbicides. And I'm not going to go through the treatment list, but I want to say this: a lot of these herbicides work on this water hemp population that's at Whitestown, Indiana. Note that treatments 6 and 13 are the only treatments that are still working for Nick at this site after he sprayed. Yes, we've got some great kill. I look at treatment 5 with Liberty. It looks very successful. I'm sure there may be some regrowth depending on the weed size, but we look at treatment 6 and 13, and that's really where the power comes through when we use residual herbicides, because you're keeping those weeds from actually competing with the crop. And ISA, the Illinois Soybean Association, actually did some research a couple of years back that suggests that we could lose $15 per acre depending on the weed density. So you look back at that image where I sprayed post chemistries, where I let weeds come up and compete with the crop, versus having that residual herbicide out there. We're actually doing us a lot of good if we've got a residual where we're not having weeds compete with our crop. To the point where you can get more bushels if we've got that kind of weed control. And I think this $15 per acre may be a little light. You look at soybean prices today, and I think that number would probably double, if not triple, due to the grain prices we have today. So just something else to keep in mind when you talk about residual herbicides versus our post-emergence herbicides. And just to put some numbers to it, I showed that image earlier. How much are we actually exposing our herbicides to if we don't utilize a pre-herbicide application? You look at on the left, we have an untreated plot here, and there were some counts done on this plot. I personally feel sorry for those who had to count these weeds, but there's about 2.6 million plants per acre that we're exposing to that herbicide treatment to come clean up where we didn't utilize a pre-herbicide. Now you go to the image on the right where we utilize the pre-herbicide. Yes, there are some weeds. We can manage that with our post-herbicide applications, but we're taking something from 2.6 million plants down to around 4,000 plants to expose to our post-herbicide application. So I can live with that. What I can't live with is exposing our post chemistries to 2.6 million plants per acre in the absence of a pre-herbicide. Another thing to look at is how long you got to make that post-herbicide application. In some cases, like I mentioned earlier, you expect WATERHEMP or Palmer Amaranth, depending on the conditions, to get to that 4-inch weed height within about 10, 15 days, depending on the conditions. But we set up a study to look at the number of days until we had 4-inch WATERHEMP after we planted and put out pre-emergence applications. And what we have here on the y-axis is the number of days until 10-centimeter WATERHEMP, which is about 4 inches. And then on the x-axis, we have herbicidal treatments. And if you look at the non-treated, that would be the lack of a pre. 18 days is when we needed to be back out there to actually get out there and spray a 4-inch WATERHEMP. And you'll see treatments like dual and metribuzin, and the combination of those two and boundary gets us about 26 to 27 days. And then we incorporate herbicides like Anthem Max and Spartan from FMC. getting us about the same amount. But when we put those together in an effective premix like Authority Edge, you can gain another 5 days by putting out 2 effective modes of action to delay the amount of time we need to get back out there with the post-emergence application to kill those 4-inch water hemp, because it's all about timing and when we want to be out there spraying. So just wanted to share that data with you all. And we've talked about high soil seed banks. And I mentioned earlier, 95% control is no longer considered a win. It's actually a failure, just based on the information I've showed you today in terms of the genetics that we're up against in these weeds, as well as the seed production that they have. So I wanted to kind of end my part of the conversation talking about what we can do with herbicides to manage that soil seed bank as we move forward. Now, to set this up, I've got 4 treatments on the bottom. On the x-axis, we have a pre with 2 modes of action, followed by a post with a residual in the first treatment. That's the overlapping residual treatment that all of us weed scientists love to recommend. But we know that Mother Nature gets in the way, so I've got some other options here. Treatment 2 is a pre with just 1 mode of action. That's actually metribuzin followed by a post. And then the third treatment, we didn't get a pre out for whatever reason. We tried to come back with a post that included a residual to get that residual out there to kind of carry us through the season. And then number 4 is a big no-no. That the post only treatment, going out with 0 residuals. And to really set this up, these treatments were deployed onto plots that we would monitor through the year. So we wanted to get a baseline on how much water hemp seed was in those treatments before we deployed them. So we pulled samples in the spring before these treatments went out. And you'll see with the red bars, they range anywhere from 72 to 91 plants per plot. Really not a huge difference when you talk about a plant that can produce up to 250,000 seed in competition with soybeans. But what we did was we got our baseline. So we know there's really not much of a difference between plots. We deployed these 4 treatments, and then we let the weeds come up, let them put on seed and let the seed rain. And then we went back the next spring and wanted to see how much the soil seed bank dynamics changed for water hemp over time in those plots. And here are the results that we got. You see in that post only application, we increased the soil seed bank by nearly 700%. Go down to treatment 3, the post with the residual. We didn't get a pre out, and all we had in our pocket was a post that included residual. Still not good enough. Still increased it up to 700%. Number 2 was really shocking to me. We got a pre with just 1 mode of action. And with metribuzin, that's putting a lot of pressure on 1 mode of action. We don't want to do that. But even coming up and cleaning up with a post after that, not including residual, we still increased the soil seed bank by 500%. The only treatment that we actually reduced the soil seed bank was the pre that had 2 modes of action, followed by a post that included a residual. So that's why, as weed scientists, get excited about this treatment option, is because it works. It's actually the only thing that will reduce the soil seed bank. So wanted to share this information with you. I think this is important. When we talk about 2022, we know there's supply issues, but one thing that we cannot cut on is residual herbicides within our system. You see how important they are, not only for weed control in 2022, but for weed control in the future of your farm and sustaining that control as we move forward. So, Nick, this is where I stop. I'm going to stop sharing it and let you take over.
All right. Well, thanks, Drake. Give me a second here. Get my screen shared. Is that showing up for you, Drake?
I've got it, Nick.
Okay, perfect. So really nice job setting up my portion of the presentation. And so I'm going to kick it off by talking about reduced rate exposure and how it could potentially affect herbicide resistance. So I tend to think of the trend in terms of rate selection as it relates to the Roundup Ready crop. So in the early stages of adoption, it was pretty common for growers to find the bottom of the glyphosate rate range for effective control And as that control slipped over time, the easy option was to go ahead and increase the rate. So initially, it wasn't out of the ordinary to see control with a Pioneer Roundup. And so just a few years ago, when growers were still utilizing the Roundup Ready technology heavily, they were employing 44 ounces as the base rate. And so that's about a 3x difference. If we evaluate the adoption of the Liberty technologies, I think a similar trend is occurring, and certainly we should be mindful of that as we move forward. But when we consider weed-heighted application, as Drake mentioned, this can be a form of employing that sublethal dose. Just reviewing a lot of what Drake had said as well, most of our post-herbicide labels specifically state maximum weed heights of 4 inches. So practically speaking, that can be pretty difficult to achieve in a field setting. It really seems like there's several deterrents that may be happening, such as weather, rainfall, even just different priorities getting in the way in terms of spraying timely. And it allows those weeds to exceed that 4-inch height before we can make the application. So as we apply these herbicides to larger than labeled weed heights, we're really initiating the same concept. Those larger plants have more metabolic capacity, more growing points to cover, thicker cuticles, the list goes on. And each of these can influence herbicide mobility in the plant and result in that sublethal dose. So this is some work that was done by Dr. Ken Smith at the University of Arkansas several years ago, but basically looking at dicamba efficacy on Palmer amaranth at various heights. So the vertical axis illustrates percent control, and our weed heights are listed on the horizontal axis. You can see we've got two different bar colors here. The red bar depicts dicamba being applied at a 1/4 pound acid equivalent per acre, and the blue bar would be the 1/2 pound acid rate, which is typical for many of the low volatility dicamba formulations that we're currently using. But the gist of this slide is that we really need to spray small, and you'll see that's an underlying theme throughout this presentation, but that's going to help us be more effective with these herbicides. You can see as we move into larger weed heights in this particular study, 4+ inches, you start to see the variability in control moving in. And we've had the question several times as we look at that 8 to 12-inch height, we actually see the lower rate trending a little bit better in terms of control. So that's an anomaly, not a real good explanation for that, other than we just typically see much more variability with any of our herbicide applications as we're spraying those larger weeds. This is not advancing for me now. There we go. So this is actually some work that we did pretty close to Murfreesboro, Illinois, several years back, but we were looking at applying dicamba in a rescue type situation after we had applied some pre-emergence herbicides. And as we looked across the top of the canopy, we felt pretty good in terms of overall control. But as we peeled that canopy back, we started to notice several of these plants that were kind of curled up. And of course, they were going to produce seed. And that's an alarming situation because we're more likely to select for resistance at that point. This is some work that we did at Mount Vernon several years ago. It was a bare ground study where we exposed this Palmer amaranth plant to a 1/2 pound of dicamba. It went ahead and twisted up, but produced seed. And so that's where we really start seeing the selection process occurring for resistance. And so one thing that we need to keep in mind with dicamba is that we've been utilizing the technology since the 60s. So there's been a great deal of selection pressure occurring over time. We don't want to deter any momentum that we have with the molecules. We certainly know that we need them to clean up some of the escapes that might happen from the pre-treatments, but we need to utilize them effectively and make sure that we are bridging the gap until we can see that next new site of action. So moving into a study that we did with Liberty a few years back in Mount Vernon as well. This was a bare ground study, and so very similar format in terms of the chart. We've got percent control on the vertical axis and then weed height on the horizontal axis. And same story, if we can spray smaller, we're much more effective with our post-herbicide technologies. And when we think about Liberty, we know that it's a contact herbicide. So we also have to be mindful of the carrier volume. We really like that 15 to 20 gallons per acre range, and make sure that we're utilizing those nozzles that are going to deliver the droplet size to get better coverage. And so when we think about Liberty, we also have to factor in some of the environmental parameters. So we like good sunlight intensity, higher relative humidity, higher temperatures, and it actually does work better if we can spray it more towards the middle of the day. So if we think about just a situation where we might be trying to optimize our efficacy with our post herbicides, Liberty included, and we're evaluating the forecast, if there's a choice day there where we can cover more acres because that day might facilitate more rapid absorption and translocation of those post herbicides, it would be good to put more eggs in that basket just to make sure that we're doing everything we can to preserve the effectiveness of our post-emergence resources. So just a beauty shot from that particular trial, and you can see where we were able to take that terminal growth out, but we did select for the axillary regrowth. And in many cases, we'd have came back and hit this with another shot of Liberty, but just for demonstration purposes, we wanted to show what that looked like. So this image illustrates how quickly a pigweed plant can grow after a field trip with dicamba. And so I think this could facilitate an opportunity for these plants to produce seed and carry that herbicide tolerance. So generally speaking, when we talk about foliar herbicide use across the trait systems, the active ingredient really needs to be applied to small weeds, and again, preferably less than 4 inches in height, just as all the data had illustrated. But I think this depicts the importance of utilizing those residual herbicides ahead of planting from a resistance management perspective, but also to provide more flexibility in allowing those smaller weed heights at the time of the post application. And that'll allow us to be more effective with those precious resources this year, where we know we might have some shortages that we're up against. So this is an example of kind of where we're heading in several areas of the Midwest and Mid-South. And so dicamba resistance is becoming more frequent and has been confirmed recently in Illinois, Tennessee, Arkansas, and some other states. But based upon the information that I could reference, we're seeing about a 5 to 10-fold resistance. And so this picture was actually taken a few years back in Tennessee. But you can see where dicamba had good activity on the apical meristem, but you're starting to see the regrowth from those lower axillary buds. And so you actually see this plant is producing seed, and that's going to carry on the resistance alleles as we move forward and does result in a mess. So some of the fields that were treated with dicamba this year kind of reminded me of the early 2010s. When glyphosate started slipping across a larger portion in the Midwest. But we have to consider that, resistance typically builds or starts as low level and builds over time. And so with the recent press indicating the potential for multiple resistance to occur, I would say that we're currently in that building phase. So where we stand right now in Illinois, WaterHemp has evolved resistance to 7 different sites of action. And this presents a challenge to our contemporary weed management systems because historically, when one particular herbicide lost efficacy, we simply switched to a different mode of action. With multiple resistance, it complicates the system because we may not have a foliar option to choose from, and we very likely could see reduced activity for certain soil applied chemistries from these groups as well. So I think it illustrates the importance of adopting those diverse weed management plans with effective herbicides, implementing some of the cultural tactics and really focusing on that zero tolerance policy for weed escapes to be successful. So this slide's always a crowd pleaser, but we wanted to take a minute to discuss the different types of resistance and just kind of setting this up. So we have target site resistance and non-target site resistance. And so with target site resistance, it's due to a mutation of a specific enzyme in a plant where the herbicide binds. And so that herbicide can no longer attach to the enzyme, allowing the plant to survive. With non-target site resistance, it's kind of a catch-all. So everything but an enzyme change. It could be plant architecture, cuticle thickness, compartmentalization of the herbicide, or maybe even metabolic resistance. And so this slide illustrates the chronology over time, showing the different resistance mechanisms that have been discovered in WaterHemp. And a key point to take home is that up until 2011, 4 out of our 5 resistance mechanisms were due to target site changes. And since then, all new mechanisms of resistance have been non-target site based. So for those 7 sites of action that WaterHemp has been confirmed resistant to, 6 of them encompass known non-target site resistance mechanisms, and only 4 are confirmed for target site resistance. So we're starting to see a shift in terms of the mechanisms of resistance to more metabolic. And if we think about it practically, this type of resistance might involve a similar detoxification pathway as our tolerant crops. So such as the same process that corn might utilize to metabolize off atrazine or HPPD inhibiting herbicides. And this can be pretty scary, but keep in mind that just because you have resistance to a specific herbicide in your field, it doesn't mean that every plant is going to confer that same resistance profile, but it should highlight the importance of tank mixing multiple sites of action with each trip that we're making across the field. So I wanted to talk through metabolism for herbicides and crops or weeds. And so just kind of a quick table to reference here. We start with the parent compound, which is toxic to that crop or weed. As we move into the three phases of metabolism, starting with the first phase, you start to see hydrolysis, oxidation, or reduction reactions occurring. And that's going to change the overall molecular structure of that herbicide and make it harder for it to reach the binding site. So at that point, it is less toxic. As we move into phase 2 of metabolism, we're starting to see sugar conjugation, and that's going to change the molecular structure even that much further. So again, making it harder for that herbicide to reach the binding site. And we're starting to minimize the toxicity at that point. As we move into the final stage of metabolism, that's where we start to notice secondary conjugation of sugars onto that core molecule and potentially incorporation into the cell walls, or it could be pumped into the vacuole for storage as well. And at that point, it's no longer toxic. So when we think about the key players in terms of detoxifying herbicides, you can see there's several mechanisms that may alter the parent herbicide structure. And so cytochrome P450 enzymes are responsible for much of the documented metabolic resistance in water hemp, but often researchers are unable to explain the resistant individuals. And you can see the complexity as there could be potentially over 1,000 genes contributing to herbicide metabolism in a weed. So now we're looking at data that was generated by Purdue University, illustrating the importance of proper use rate selection, in addition to timely applications on MARESTAIL in terms of weed height to optimize success. So fortunately with this species, we're not dealing with the same resistance profile as water hemp, and it allows us to utilize more chemistries. But as we focus on 2,4-D for this particular slide, the columns on the left-hand side represent the use rate, and those on the right-hand side depict percent growth reduction by the respective weed height. So what we notice is that the higher use rates applied at an earlier weed height allows for the best control. And so the take home is, whether we're targeting water hemp or MARESTAIL or you name it, spraying smaller plants at proper use rates is a driver for effective control. So these images illustrate how effective our auxin technologies can be on MARESTAIL. And this is around a half-pound acid equivalent of DICAMBA and a pound acid equivalent of 2,4-D. And those are kind of the standard use rates for our low volatility formulations. But you still see some slippage due to plant height at the time of application, in addition to density and coverage. So as you look at the check strips there on either side of the treatment, you can see a pretty high density of MARESTAIL, and those plants can kind of cover each other up, and that's going to influence our deposition of the herbicide. So I would say the majority of the plants escaping this treatment, though, were more due to the height at the time of application. Again, this trend is very similar to the data that we've been showing in terms of, if we can spray small, we're going to be much more effective. So as we utilize those residual herbicides to take some of the pressure off of our post technologies, that's going to help us make that foliar application count. And so given the herbicide shortages that we're up against this year, we really can't afford to fail, as we may not be able to access additional material to clean up in a rescue type situation. So this slide illustrates some of the critical weed management timings as it relates to crop development. And so just to put this into perspective, in terms of weed emergence and selection pressure, just as a general rule of thumb, it takes about 3 weeks for Palmer amaranth to go from germination to flowering. So if we only apply one product with foliar activity during this 3-week period, we're placing all the selection pressure on that product. So we really have to think about season-long control, removing those plants prior to seed set and that sequential application strategy, and then removing those escapes with herbicides or tillage after harvest. And that's going to reduce seed entry back into the bank and also allow us to potentially jumpstart our control of MARESTAIL, as well as some of the winter annuals that could be creeping in at that time. So this data represents research that was conducted in 2009 and 10. And so the prices don't really reflect what we're up against today, but just to set the slide up, there's 3 different management levels encompassing 1, 2, and 3 effective sites of action. So the vertical axis on the left-hand side is a metric for yield in bushels per acre, and the vertical axis on the right demonstrates water hemp density per square foot. So the blue bar indicates yield, and the red filled circles represent water hemp density. The higher the blue bars and the lower the red dots would illustrate improved water hemp control and profitability through crop yield. So if we look at situations where there was more of an upfront spend, employing additional sites of action on water hemp, the density was lower at the end of the season and our crop yield was higher. So often we get into situations where we might try to save money up front by using setup rates or no residual at all and follow with our foliar treatments, which often might not be effective. And that's going to cost us more money in the long run with some of the retreatment efforts. So from a grower perspective, incorporating those residual treatments increases our production costs, but hopefully this data helps depict that the long-term payoff is worth it. So here's another mode of action screen that we did in Whitestown a few years back. And so the weed heights varied at the time of application and many exceeded the label, but it's kind of a practical representation of what might occur in the field due to weather events or other priorities kind of getting in the way. But basically, we evaluated active ingredients from 4 different commonly used foliar sites of action, those being group 2, 4, 10, and 14 herbicides. And what we noticed is that even when we look at some of the newer formulations of dicamba or 2,4-D, in addition to Liberty, which we're relying heavily upon for foliar control, they just aren't getting it done on some of those larger weeds. So I think this slide illustrates the importance of incorporating those residual herbicides with at least 2 effective sites of action to start clean and finish easier, where we know we're going to be challenged with some of those post-emergence applications. So this is really what we want to avoid. And so if pigweeds escape our herbicide treatments, they're not only contributing seed back into the bank to secure future problems, but also robbing resources from that developing crop. And so if these plants escape our post applications, in many cases, there are no other options to clean the fields up. And in order to get ahead of the pigweeds, it really requires that zero tolerance approach. And so the only option to limit seed return at this point was to hoe the plants out and carry them from the field. So in previous years, again, growers may have decided to save money and choose not to add residual products throughout the season, which obviously resulted in weed escapes. And they ended up paying for a roguing crew. And that obviously would also increase your production cost exponentially. And this was pretty common in the Mid-South at one time. So what about new chemistry? In the heyday of discovery, there was about 18 to 20 companies actively working to find new active ingredients. And at the onset of the Roundup Ready technology, many companies merged or exited the herbicide discovery business because it just didn't pay to invest due to the broad scale adoption of the glyphosate technology. So currently there's 5 companies in herbicide discovery, and FMC is fortunate to be participating in this space, but it stresses the importance of keeping the current tools we have effective, as we don't anticipate seeing a new mode of action for pigweed control and row crops in the near future. So now I want to shift gears to some of the holistic options that we may not pour from a jug to just kind of build an overall program to manage our pigweed species. But before I do that, I wanted to just kind of review the herbicide discovery timeline. And the key takeaway from this particular slide is that the newest herbicide technology that we're currently utilizing in row crops, in terms of when it was discovered, was over 30 years ago. And so it definitely highlights the importance of keeping those tools we currently have effective to bridge the gap until we can see that next new site of action. But as we focus on some of the options that maybe we don't pour out of a jug, I think this is one of the low-hanging fruit that we could potentially implement, not only to manage some of our pigweed flushes, but also to take some of the pressure off of our burn down herbicides. So we could potentially stretch those resources to apply them in a post-emergence type situation if we implement that tillage pass to take care of that first flush. But this is some work that was done by Dr. Bradley at the University of Missouri a few years back. But basically looking at the vertical axis, it's late season density, plants per 6 meters squared. And then we have the tillage regime on the horizontal axis. And what we notice is we get more aggressive with our tillage pass, it can influence that late season density. And so taking advantage of some of the characteristics for maybe WATERHEMP, Palmer Amaranth, MARESTAIL that are much more small seeded. And so as we implement that deep tillage pass, we are able to bury that seed and influence how it's emerging. But we need to be mindful of our soil conservation tactics, and we don't want to deter those. And I think this is going to be more of a fit on those less erosive soils where we do have higher pigweed densities. So this chart is set up very similar to the previous. And so we have late season density plants per 6 meters squared again on that vertical axis, but now we're looking at row spacing on the horizontal axis. So you can see as we go from 30-inch row spacing down to 15-inch or drilled row spacing, which would be 7.5 inches, certainly that's influencing our emergence patterns for these weeds in terms of the late season counts. And so this is also one of the options that I would consider more of a low-hanging fruit to implement in terms of seeding our soybean crop this year. In my area, we have a fair amount of wheat production. So the drill sitting in the barn, it's really just a function of utilizing it to seed that soybean crop. And so what we're trying to accomplish here is kind of bunch these plants together, get them competing with each other. It will result in longer internodes and just a quicker shading effect from canopy closure. And that's going to help us take some of the pressure off those post-emergence herbicides. A few beauty shots here from Whitestown to drive that home. Basically, we looked at two different row spacing, 30-inch and 15-inch row spacing. You can see by narrowing up those rows to 15s, we were able to reduce the density of weeds by half. And so again, that's going to help us take the selection pressure off our post applications. But as we think about the wider row spacing, we still have a fair amount of acres in the central part of Illinois of soybeans that will get seeded at 30-inch rows. And so we have to be mindful of that and make sure that we're utilizing active ingredients with long soil half-lives at the proper use rate for the soil type in order to provide that residual activity until we get to canopy. We've done some work with the University of Illinois over the years, and what we've shown is that it takes 23 additional days to reach canopy in that 30-inch system versus the 15s. So now we're looking at some similar data from Dr. Bradley's lab, again, where we've got late season density on the vertical axis and then row space or seeding rate on the horizontal axis. And what we see is that when we get 160,000 plants or more out there, we can influence that emergence pattern. So this is going to be more of a balancing act, in my opinion. So we've got a lot more corn and soybeans being planted at the same time now. And if we seed soybeans in early April or throughout the month of April, really at north of 160,000 plants per acre, we're more likely to set ourselves up for a negative consequence in terms of seeing some late season lodging. So what about cover crops? And so this slide illustrates that they certainly can be an effective management tool for suppressing summer annual weeds. And so as we set the slide up, we've got several different cover crop species listed on the vertical axis and the relative summer annual weed emergence on the horizontal axis. So what we notice is that many of the more dense species such as cereal rye and wheat that reach canopy quickly could provide greater levels of suppression than that traditional treatment for burn down of glyphosate and 2,4-D. So in areas where we have shorter growing seasons, oftentimes it's difficult to establish that cover crop after the cash crop is harvested. But I think this data does make a case to incorporate those cover crops within an integrated strategy to kind of augment our overall weed control. But we can also take advantage of some of the late season nutrient scavenging effects of employing these cover crops as well. Again, it does require a balancing act in terms of species selection and then figuring out an adequate planning and termination date to be effective. So this is the question we face each season. And so many times these escapes are evident just prior to harvest, and no weed scientist can look at this plant and tell you what the resistance profile might be, but they can assure you that this female plant will contribute seed back into the bank and carry whatever resistant allele she has into the next season and beyond. So I think it highlights the importance of practicing zero tolerance for seed return in order to keep the seed bank static at the very least and set the stage for effective management in the coming years. So it would be beneficial to remove this individual by hand. And I know it kind of comes into some practicality issues as we have much larger farm sizes, but it certainly would be a good thing to pull this out and carry it from the field. And you may have heard it referred to as pig hunting. So load up the cooler and the side-by-side and send your poor children after these escapes. So just wanted to kind of close things out, covering some of the key things that we discussed today and how we implement them. So certainly our practices should be focused on reducing that soil seed bank over time. We've heard it for years: start clean, stay clean, finish easy. focus on maximizing our diversity and our weed control practices. So rotate crops, traits, and chemistries. Oftentimes we'll discuss bringing wheat into the rotation. And so in my area, we have a fair amount of double crop soybeans. So that's typically a profitable option. But as we move into other crops, we're inherently utilizing different sites of action, typically for herbicides. So that'll help us diversify that system. But we can also take advantage of when canopy occurs. So with wheat, normally we have a pretty dense canopy by the time water hemp starts emerging. So inherently you're getting a control factor. As we think about multiple modes of action within a crop, we definitely want to implement at least 2 sites of action with activity on the targeted species with each application. Don't want to cut rates. We've hit on that frequently throughout this presentation, and we want to apply those herbicides in a timely manner. Always utilize those pre-emergence and pre-plant herbicides to take the pressure off the post applications. Do anything we can to maximize our crop competition. So I think that's one of the overlooked factors in terms of getting a quicker canopy. And it could be as simple as just making sure that we have adequate fertility out there. We're doing everything we can to optimize the early and mid-season vigor, but also we want to maintain that vigor. So if we have diseases or insects that are defoliating the canopy, it might be a good thing to employ an insecticide fungicide combination to retain that canopy. But it also could be as simple as just cultivar selection. So picking those hybrids or varieties that are more efficient at putting on the above ground growth. Certainly we want to integrate those non-chemical practices where feasible, such as what we discussed, and focus on zero tolerance for escape, because that's what's going to set the stage for effective soil seed bank management. So in summary, we really hope you gained a better understanding of just the weed biology and its impact on crop production, some of the tools that we can utilize to manage the soil seed bank, and then implementing the overall strategy, focusing on chemical practices as well as those that we may not pour out of a jug. So that'll wrap up the slide content. I really appreciate the time today, and Drake and I would be happy to take any questions you might have.
Great. Thanks so much for that presentation, Nick and Drake. We're now going to begin taking questions from attendees. So if you have one, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. We just got one question in here that says, how is the emerging drone post-application with low rate carrier going to affect control?
I'll try to tackle this one, Nick, and if you got something to add, please do. But you look at the herbicides that we have on the market today, obviously carrier volume is one of the things that drives great control with those products. So maybe in some cases it may not be feasible, but I do think there's a place for it. You look at technology in general, the See and Spray technology from John Deere, there's a lot of cool stuff coming out. And I wouldn't be surprised in the next 5 to 10 years if that totally changes the way we apply herbicides. But thank you for the question. Today, that's the best answer I've got in terms of carrier volume for herbicides working. But I think there's a lot more in the upcoming years that we're going to find out on how we can utilize technology for these applications.
Okay, again, if you have a question, please go ahead and send it into the Q&A. I'll give it another minute here to see if any more come in, but do either of you maybe want to share a piece of advice or some insights as we look toward getting into the field and starting to plant over the next few weeks? Is there anything in particular we need to watch out for in 2022?
I would say, you know, you look at the challenges we have in front of us for 2022, and I guess the term I'll use is just be flexible and open-minded. There's going to be some chemistries that you've relied on for the past couple of years that you may not have access to. So trust your agronomist that you're working with. There may be some other products or technologies out there that you're not aware of, or you may be using some products that you haven't used in 10 or 20 years that are still effective. So just keeping that open mindset would be my biggest piece of advice.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, having multiple plans in place and fallback options will be critical, but also making sure that, you know, whatever alternative plans that we have in the hopper, basically, that they are going to be effective. So it's important to refer to some of the university weed guides and make sure that we're referencing those herbicide efficacy tables. Also, when we think about some of the shortages that we're up against, I think it's going to kind of force our hand in terms of practicing resistance management and managing those weeds in the soil. And so it's no secret that early season weed competition can cost growers yield and money. So that could be a benefit of implementing products that we haven't utilized for a number of years that do have good soil residual activity, is that we're going to manage those weeds throughout the season in the soil and preserve those resources for the crop. And that should optimize our overall yield potential.
Okay, thank you both. I don't see any other questions in the queue, so I think we can go ahead and wrap up. But I want to take a moment to thank both Nick and Drake for their presentation today, and thank you to our corporate partner FMC for sponsoring today's webinar. You will be able to find a recording of today's webinar on ISA's YouTube channel shortly here this afternoon. And thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.